In this episode of Blood and Cancer News, single and multifractional stereotactic body radiotherapy is comparable for lung mets, and statins may lower the risk of colorectal cancer for patients with IBD. This is Blood and Cancer News, the news show in the Blood and Cancer podcast feed. I am your host, Nick Andrews. Remember, you can email the show at podcasts@mdh.com. You can subscribe and listen wherever podcasts are found. We begin today with our top story. New data from a large study confirms that different types of hormone replacement therapy are indeed associated with an increased risk of breast cancer. But this new study shows that the risk could be lower than recently published data suggest. In the study, researchers evaluated all types of hormone replacement therapy that have been commonly prescribed in the UK in the past 20 years. The researchers grouped the use of hormone replacement therapy use by either recent, for those who have had used it in the past 5 years, or by past, for those who had used hormone replacement therapy more than 5 years ago. They included just under 100,000 women between 50 and 80 years old who were first diagnosed with breast cancer between 1998 and 2019. These women were then matched by age and general practice with about 500,000 women who were not diagnosed with breast cancer during the same period. 34% of women in the breast cancer group reported using hormone replacement therapy, and about 31% of women in the control group reported using HRT. Overall, the researchers reported that the risk of breast cancer was increased with hormone replacement therapy drugs. The odds ratio was 1.21 with a statistically significant confidence interval. The researchers reported that the highest risk appeared associated with combined estrogen and progesterone, which had a statistically significant odds ratio of 1.26, while the lowest risk was tied to estrogen-only therapy with a statistically significant ratio of 1.06. HRT-associated breast cancer risk increased with age and declined after discontinuing treatment. Therapy of less than 1 year was not associated with increased breast cancer risk. In this study, the researchers also looked into how long risk persisted after a patient stopped using hormone replacement therapy. They found that among women who discontinued HRT 5 or more years ago, the risk for breast cancer was no longer increased for long-term estrogen therapy and short-term estrogen plus progesterone therapy. However, they did find that the risk of breast cancer remained elevated for 5 years after a patient discontinued estrogen-progesterone combo therapy. That longer-term odds ratio was 1.16 and was also statistically significant. Overall, these data both confirm and contradict earlier findings from HRT and breast cancer risk reported by a meta-analysis from The Lancet back in 2019. You can find a link to that study in the show notes, of course. This most recent study was published in the BMJ in late October of 2020, but it began before the publication of the 2019 Lancet meta-analysis. In the UK, the conclusion from the meta-analysis in 2019 made waves in the general population and among mainstream media. This, in turn, led to a UK regulatory safety alert for hormone replacement therapy. Experts in the field questioned the alert and said that it caused undue anxiety among the public. Because of the Lancet study, the European Medicines Agency issued its own safety alert. The results here are broadly similar between the two studies, as they both suggest increased risk for breast cancer with hormone replacement therapy. However, they differ in how high the risk is, how quickly that risk subsides after finishing hormone replacement therapy. The most recent publication, which is the one published in the BMJ, suggests that breast cancer risk diminishes far more rapidly than was found in the meta-analysis. Dr. Yana Vinogradoova is a PhD medical statistician at the University of Nottingham in England. She was also the first author of the BMJ study. In an interview, Dr. Vinogradoova told Blood and Cancer that the discrepancy between the findings could be due to design differences. She went on to note that the meta-analysis included results from 24 studies that were conducted around the world and at different periods, and they included women with varying backgrounds and ages. Those studies also used different methods, like questionnaires, which rely on the memory of women in the study. By comparison, the study she and her colleagues published used EMR data, which was collected prospectively. She said that because this study used a consistent design and consistent data sources, these new results are likely to be more accurate and reliable for assessing risk with hormone replacement therapy. And results from a phase 2 trial suggest that stereotactic body radiotherapy for lung oligometastases have similar efficacy and safety, whether delivered in multiple fractions or in just one fraction. The study was reported at ASTRO 2020, which is the annual meeting of the American Society for Radiation Oncology. In the study, researchers enrolled 90 patients from 13 studies in Australia and New Zealand, all of whom had between 1 and 3 lung mets that measured up to 5 centimeters in diameter and were located in the periphery. The metastases were from non-hematologic primary malignancies, the most common of which were colorectal, lung, and kidney. All of the primary and extrathoracic disease had been definitely treated. Patients were randomly assigned to receive stereotactic body RT in either a single fraction regimen of 28 or in a multi-fraction regimen of 48 in 4 fractions that netted the same biological equivalent dose. The researchers reported that the treatment groups did not differ significantly with respect to any grade toxicities at 1 year, with the exception of higher rates of esophagitis and radiation dermatitis in the multi-fraction group. The primary endpoint was grade 3 or worse toxicity at 1 year. The researchers report that the rate was 5% with the single fraction group and 3% with the multi-fraction group. The single fraction and multi-fraction groups were also similar at 1 year on rates of freedom from local failure, disease-free survival, and overall survival. These data could be particularly relevant in 2020 and the subsequent months due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Dr. Shankar Siva is a researcher with Peter MacCallum Cancer Centre in Melbourne, Australia. He said that single-session SBRT is safe, convenient, and non-invasive, and appears to be effective to date for lung secondaries. This approach may be considered as a one-stop knockout type of approach for patients who have 1 to 3 lung mets. He also said that these findings have implications for treatment selection in a resource-constrained environment such as the current pandemic, as it could reduce foot traffic. And finally today, statin use may significantly lower the risk of colorectal cancer in patients with or without inflammatory bowel disease. This is according to the results of a meta-analysis and systematic review that was presented at the 2020 annual meeting of the American College of Gastroenterology. Previously published studies have reported a 9% colorectal cancer risk reduction in statin users who did not have IBD. In patients with IBD, however, data were scarce, thus prompting this research. In the study, researchers further evaluated statin use in colorectal cancer in patients without IBD by analyzing from 52 studies, which included 8 randomized clinical trials and more than 11 million patients, about 2 million of whom used statins. To evaluate the same relationship in patients with IBD, the investigators conducted a separate meta-analysis involving more than 15,000 patients from 5 observational studies, one of which was an unpublished abstract. In the 4 published studies in the meta-analysis, more than 1,100 patients used statins, while about 12,000 did not. The researchers reported that among the non-IBD population, statin use was associated with a 20% reduced risk in colorectal cancer. Among patients with IBD, they found that statins were associated with a 60% reduction in colorectal cancer risk. While publication bias was absent from the non-IBD analysis, it was detected in the IBD portion of the study. The researchers said that selection bias may have also been present in the IBD analysis due to the exclusive use of the observational studies. And that's a wrap on Blood and Cancer News. Remember, you can find links to these news stories in the show notes, as well as some subsequent journal materials. Blood and Cancer is produced by editor Jen Smith. It's edited by editor Mark Lesney. All of our podcasts are produced by executive editor Kathy Scarbeck. I'm Nick Andrews, and you're listening to Blood and Cancer.